So, we've left the smoky little huts of peasants, and now we drift up the social ladder. Higher ceilings, thicker walls, and, theoretically, more comfort. But as with most things in history, theory and reality didn't always match. Medieval kings and queens had palaces, sure, but heating? Still questionable. Take castles. They look impressive on postcards, with their towers and battlements. But inside, they were giant stone refrigerators. Thick walls did keep you safe from invaders. They also kept the cold in like a walk-in freezer. If you've ever been in a stone church in winter, you know the vibe. Damp, echoey, and so cold that your breath fogs up while you pray. Imagine living in that every day. Fireplaces existed, yes, but not the cozy little ones you picture. Early medieval castles often had open hearths, and the smoke just went out through a hole in the roof. Or didn't. So you got smoke in the eyes, and your tapestries smelling like campfire forever. Chimneys only became common later, around the 12th century. Before that, winter nights for royals were basically the same as peasants. Smoky rooms, coughs, and layers upon layers of itchy wool. Now, to combat this, nobles used tapestries. Thick woven wall hangings, not just for decoration, but for insulation. They hung them on stone walls to keep out drafts. And yes, these were sometimes embroidered with majestic scenes of hunts and battles. But their main function was basically medieval bubble wrap. Even kings had to insulate their bedrooms like student rentals. Beds were the royal solution to cold. Not just any bed, but massive wooden four-posters, surrounded by heavy curtains. The idea was simple. Close the curtains, trap the heat. It was basically your own little fabric tent. Some even had warming pans, metal trays filled with hot coals, slid under the covers before bed. Which sounds ingenious, until you remember fire safety wasn't a concept. There are actual records of beds catching fire. Nothing says royal luxury like accidentally roasting yourself overnight. Now, let's look at specific royals who had complicated relationships with cold. One famous example is Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. He built Versailles, a palace famous for its endless gilded rooms and impossible heating bills. The place was enormous, but the fireplaces couldn't keep up. Courtiers complained of frost forming on the inside of windows, even while wearing layers of silk and fur. Imagine trying to look elegant at a ball while your champagne is literally freezing. And then there's Henry VIII of England, a man better known for his wives than his winters. But Henry hated being cold. He lined his chambers with furs, wore layers of heavy velvet, and kept braziers burning constantly. Even his palaces had complaints, though. Hampton Court was drafty enough that courtiers wrapped themselves in cloaks indoors. The irony is, Henry kept building bigger palaces, which only made heating harder. But of course he did. Subtlety was never Henry's style. Queens weren't immune, either. Isabella of Castile, co-sponsor of Columbus, spent winters traveling through drafty castles on horseback. Chroniclers mention her teeth chattering while wrapped in multiple cloaks. She also fasted often for religious reasons, which didn't help. Imagine trying to warm up on nothing but holy devotion and cold bread. It's impressive she made it through so many campaigns. And then there's the clothing itself. Royals could afford furs. Sable, ermine, fox. Basically, if it was fluffy, it became a cape. Ermine especially became the luxury fur of choice because it was white with little black tips, which meant every royal portrait looked like a fashion ad for expensive rodents. But wearing fur didn't always mean warmth, it meant status. Many nobles froze in layers of silk and brocade because silk looked better than cheap wool. Priorities. Now, just like peasants, royals relied on food for winter survival. Banquets were filled with preserved meats, pies, and spiced wine. Spices were not just for flavor. They were believed to warm the body. Nutmeg, cinnamon, ginger. So drinking mulled wine by the fire was less festive and more desperate attempt at circulation. Which, honestly, isn't that different from today. One especially unlucky royal was Charles VI of France, nicknamed Charles the Mad. Besides his bouts of mental illness, winters made things worse. He sometimes refused to bathe or change clothes, believing his body would shatter like glass, which meant weeks of sitting in freezing halls, unwashed, wrapped in dirty garments, terrified of drafts. Imagine being his courtiers, freezing, choking on smoke, and trying to agree politely when the king declared himself made of glass. Even royalty wasn't spared from segmented sleep. Night watches were common, candles burned low, and people lay in bed whispering or praying. Royal bedrooms were often filled with attendants, pages, or guards. Privacy was minimal, so your midnight shiver session wasn't a lonely affair, it was a group activity. And then, of course, there was travel. Kings and queens didn't stay put. They traveled constantly between castles and estates. Winter roads were mud, ice, or both. Carriages had no suspension. Horses slipped. Nobles often wrapped themselves in furs and still ended up half frozen after a day's ride. It wasn't unusual for a royal procession to arrive looking more like bedraggled refugees than glittering rulers. But prestige demanded appearances, even when your nose was running and your cloak smelled like wet fox. So, did royals have it better than peasants in winter? Technically, yes. More food, more furs, bigger fires. But in many ways, they just suffered more luxuriously. Cold stone is still cold, even if you cover it in tapestries. Smoke is still smoke, even if it drifts over gold candlesticks. And nothing stops frostbite when your carriage gets stuck in a snowdrift. It's comforting, in a way. Winter was the great equalizer. Whether you were a barefoot peasant or a king wrapped in ermine, you still shivered. You still complained. And you still dreamed of spring. Now, let's float away from castles and huts and into monasteries. Because monks had their own curious ways of enduring the cold, equal parts practical and absurdly uncomfortable.